I'm going to get us started, but want to say that if you are listening to me in English, please use the English channel in the interpretation with the globe at the bottom. We have interpretation in French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Arabic today. So please choose the language that you want to hear this conversation in. Many of us will be speaking in those languages, so please choose that now so that you're not scrambling when others are speaking. It's lovely to see everyone come in, and thank you for sharing in the chat where you're joining from. It's beautiful to see so many of you here. We have about 150 folks so far. My name is Hakima. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm with the Black Feminist Fund team. The Black Feminist Fund was created for one very straightforward purpose, and that's to significantly increase the resourcing flowing to Black feminist movements globally. In this conversation, you're going to hear from some powerful and brilliant Black feminist activists and funders who will talk to us about what's going on in Europe. It kicks off our Black Feminist Politics Series, which is intended for a large audience to get to hear from Black feminist analysis and perspectives of our global situation. We know that action and reflection need to come together in order for the transformation that we seek. We're exploring with all of you through this series the collective knowledge of Black feminist movements in their inherent diversity. And in this global moment, when all the interconnection of systems of oppression becomes even more evident, this series is really intended to spotlight the power of Black feminist politics and movements and the ongoing contribution of Black feminisms to liberation. Now, we're starting with a conversation about Western Europe, and you might be wondering why, mostly because of timing. When we were designing the series, the first round election results in France had just come in, once again putting the Rassemblement National, a fascist party, even if touting itself as fascist light, leading the polls. A few weeks later, white nationalists took to the streets of the UK. As someone who grew up and experienced the UK and Europe through the 80s and 90s, I can tell you that's not new. I would argue it's not even particularly increasing. Fascism is a current of European political thought, but what's important is that it can be defeated. And that's what we're going to talk about today. For Black feminists from and living in the global South, an internationalist lens is important and I would say even self-evident. We know that European and North American imperialism impact our lives, our economies, and even our security, and that white nationalist fascism is fueling the divisions and the violence against LGBTIQ people and women in our communities. For those of us in Africa, we know that the Mediterranean between Europe and Africa has become a mass grave of African people, and that North Africa has been externalized falsely as the border of Europe. Our leaders, our comprador leaders, benefit from and collaborate with these powers outside of the interests of our people, and proxy wars are being fought on our soil. For those of us in the Americas, we know that reparations due us from Europe are long overdue, and I'm taking a moment here also to think of Haiti. Related to this conversation, we can't ignore that aid and resources also from Europe to Black feminist groups globally are impacted by the tide of fascist and reactionary leaders and movements in Europe. And I think we rarely get to hear the analysis of Black feminist movements in and from Europe in a global conversation. So I'm particularly excited to hear from all the folks that we've brought together today. Before I pass the mic, I have to give a big shout out to Maria Clara, who you'll meet later, who is the Black Feminist Fund's Movement Partnerships Coordinator. Maria Clara is the brains and the hands behind this series. I also, though, want to give a big shout out to the whole BFF team who are making all the things happen off camera to make this work, and to our interpreters, the Black Feminists Language Justice crew who make it possible for us to have a global conversation. Lastly, but certainly not least, I want to give a special thanks to Sarah, who I'm going to pass the mic to, who's working with us as a communication strategist and is an amazing facilitator and is going to hold us through this conversation. So with that, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hakima. Good afternoon. And welcome to this meeting. It is really wonderful to see everybody joining the meeting. And we had really many people who actually registered to join the meeting. Thank you for having decided to be a part and to spend a part of your Wednesday with us. So we're going. I think we're waiting for everybody to be connected. Maybe you can go and get a glass of water, perhaps a cup of tea, and I can see that there is a lot of information in the chat box about what is happening today. So you're telling us in the chat where you are and what kind of energy you bring into this space, and there are many who are in Europe. My energy is so when you come with an energy of curiosity, perhaps you are tired, perhaps you're peaceful, or whatever you bring, all the energies are welcome here. Hakima, my name is Sarah. I am going to moderate this conversation this afternoon. And we're going to highlight the obstacles that feminist movements are confronted with, at least within the European context, and we're going to be able to talk about the strategies that we can implement, and we're also going to talk about our victories, our failures as we have been fighting against oppression, and within the European political context, of course. So let me just repeat again very quickly. Let me talk about the few months that have gone by. We're talking about the fascist parties that have won elections in European countries, the rise of neo-Nazi movement in Germany, the very violent impact of what has been happening in the United Kingdom. And in France, France is going slowly towards is going towards more and more is rising against the democracy. There are many other countries.
All right, can I stop you for a moment? We have multiple languages in the English channel. Interpreters, please make sure that you're in your right channel. We have English, Portuguese, French, Spanish, and Arabic. Thank you. Sorry, Sarah, please continue.
And maybe Sarah needs to speak a little bit closer to the microphone, Naima, if possible. So we're going to talk about what is happening in other countries, but I'm going to give the floor to our panelists so that they can talk in greater detail about their context, their geographical context, their realities in which the socio, the political realities in which they live. And so I would like to invite us to ask questions, to talk to us about your experience, and to interact in the chat. And don't hesitate to share anything. And I'm also going to do everything that I can to speak slowly. I'll try to speak slower than I normally do so that the interpreters can work. And thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, so that interpreters have time to interpret what I am saying into Arabic, into Spanish, into Portuguese, and into English. So a reminder that for our panelists that they too should speak slowly. And so I'm going to speak a little bit louder for the interpreters. So I'm going to introduce our panelists before we launch our conversation this afternoon. We're going to share their biographies in the chat. We're going to talk about their experience. Let's look at Anik, the Afro-feminist collective. She organizes a support group for Black women, and as well as the European Festival of Black Feminists. Anik, yeah, we would like to see you. So we have Eden. She is she works for the reproductive justice, and it she works she works on sexual and reproductive health issues. Then we have Hakeem, somebody from the FASTA Center. And finally, we have the pleasure of having with us an interpreter, a writer, a caricaturist who presents we're going to work to organize a number of activities and workshops around popular education. And so thank you very much, thank you very, very much to all the panelists for having accepted our invitation and to be part of this conversation this morning. So to begin, I think we could perhaps look at the context and I'm going to ask you to give us the geographic and national context in which each one of you works as concerns the rising of fascism. Give us your political context. How do you see, how are the women impacted Black communities in Europe and in the respective countries in which you live and work? We're going to start with Anik. Oh, thank you very much, Sarah. And so the Moissy collective that I represent this afternoon is based in Paris, in France. It's been in existence since 2014. Now, the context in which we work, let me begin by saying that this is very important, because oftentimes we forget to say that outside of Europe, maybe people may not know that, but that the police in France is the most merciless of police forces in Europe. So maybe people think sometimes it could be the United Kingdom or other countries, but the police is the killer most police force in Europe. Now, us, we are feminist, anti-fascist, and when there is any kind of police violence, we organize ourselves so that because the police are linked with the colonial history of France. So we organize demonstrations against them. And then our context is a context of the uprising of the extreme right since the 1970s, when the extreme right started having significant successes during elections. And these last few years, because it was in 2002 that the extreme right parties, I mentioned the National Front, the Rassemblement National, and for it was the first time that they went into the second cycle of elections in these last 20 years. They're living in very real, concrete fear of one day seeing an extreme right party win the election, the presidential elections, and obviously it would be a complete disaster for the people, for people from mixed race people or Black people for whom we work in France. And now the context that we're in as I speak now is that, as you said, we have had European elections in May. The extreme right won with a kind of with very clear racist speeches, something that has been rising in these last years, but really was at the forefront because of the elections that were being organized, and they really deepened the climate in the context of authoritarianism from President Emmanuel Macron. At the beginning, he was part of a centrist political party, but which really now, looking at it, has really changed its character. And then for us, one thing that in particular that we have noticed is the advancement, the fact that we do not talk about the impact of policies and laws that have been adopted by this government on the Black people and the Black women in particular. Let me give you just an example. For example, the review of retirement, which has been posted to extend the years in which one can work, and which made it much more difficult for the work, for one's work to be recognized as being hard work. And the fact that that is not acknowledged. So the first people who are going to be impacted by that are Black women who oftentimes have very hard work, insecure work, part-time work, and so on and so forth. And so within the population and among the people, there is this facilitation of the laws that are being passed by the fascists, and these laws have an impact on Black women and queer and Black queer persons. That's what I can say at this point in time. Thank you very much, Nika. I'll give the floor to Adam, please.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here to be speaking to all of you. First off, there's so many ways, because this question is such a huge question. There's so many ways and direction we could go, but I think I will attempt to start from most recent events, which Hakima mentioned in the introduction to this event this evening. And we saw a far-right mobilization on the streets of the UK very recently. And I've been in the UK since 2006, and I can tell you every single year since 2009, I have been at least on one anti-racism demonstration, either in the town or the city that I lived in. So this isn't new. Those of us who have either been attending these marches, who have been organizing, or who experience this fascist and racist, programs, know that it's nothing new. And Hakima talked about that in the very beginning as well. And I think that what's different this time is that, and not so much different, but so much the same, is that, the political establishment has really emboldened the recent far-right mobilization. Like, you can't turn on the newspaper without seeing, negative conversations either about Black people, about Asian people, about migrant people, particularly about refugees who are trying to cross, who are fleeing areas and places that Britain either has a direct involvement or profits from, right? People are fleeing those places to come and find safety, and you cannot turn a newspaper, news channel without seeing absolutely disgusting rhetoric about these people. And that really coincides with, the economic decline. When I say economic decline for working people, right? Because we know that the rich have continued to get richer, right? Whilst working people are seeing their wage either stagnate or unable to live on the wages that they used to work on, unemployment is on the rise. So the far-right fascist or even to some extent mainstream political parties use this as a dividing tool between the working class communities, of which Black people and brown people belong to as well. But, race then becomes the thing that's different. And so that is used to, whip up racism and fascism among those communities. And we saw, far-right mobilization outside hotels that house outside hotels that house refugees and asylum seekers, and there were even attempts to burn those places down whilst the police stood by and watched, right? And so you have, the anti-fascist mobilization also show up again to protect these people, to protect communities. We had lots of community organizing telling people to stick together, to travel in groups, etc. And, we encourage people to not stop doing things that they would normally do, right? And so we see this fascist mobilization, and we see the prime minister come out, and, the political class likes to distance himself from this, even though they create it, right? They're the ones that give it the fuel to grow. They like to distance themselves from it. The prime minister came and he said, this is far-right thuggery. He couldn't even call it fascism or racism because they are part of that project, right? So they're not going to name the thing that they're feeding and fueling. And, immediately people were arrested and immediately people were sentenced. And that in itself is political theater, right? It's to say to people, look, we've caught the bad ones, right? We've locked them up. They've agreed that they've done this horrible thing. It's all very British. We've locked them up now. Everything's great. Everything's fine. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. But what we know is that the mainstream political party, you know, we've had the Conservative government for the last 15 years. We have recently changed into a Labour government, which used to be left wing, but no longer is. It's very much conceding to the center and the right. It's very much, oh, we're going to be tough on immigration. It's very much, well, we don't have any money, so working people have to pay tax while the rich get richer. And so these are the tools that are used to sort of, you know, fuel the fascist campaigns that we're seeing. And like we said earlier, they affect, you know, Black women and gender diverse people on the street. We've had years and years of, you know, in Britain, it's called culture wars of, you know, transphobia at this highest peak in national newspaper, on TV, people being openly transphobic and calling for, you know, the destruction of communities, questioning people, etc. We've seen that really become like mainstream, and all of these things are connected. They don't happen in a vacuum, but part of the political theater is, you know, the political class will come out and say, no, this is not us. And, you know, the rhetoric is, oh, but we're trying to protect people. We're trying to, but they're not protecting anyone but themselves. They're not protecting anyone but, you know, the capital. They're not protecting anyone but their funders of these different political parties. And so this is how the growth of, you know, fascist campaigns, you know, in the mainstream political parties, but also in the streets, in communities, are impacting Black women and gender diverse people who were, again, coming to seek haven in Europe, and also those who were from Europe.
Thank you very much. I saw many emojis. I think it is very important to bring these ideas at the very heart of our conversation, and we'll come back to it when we open the discussion. I'm going to give the floor to Iki so that he can make a presentation.
Thank you so much, everybody, for the space. I'm thanking all of our ancestors that we can all be here thanks to them. Right now, I'm on this plantation called Spain. I'd like to call as the plantation of these nations as extensions of plantations, basically. And Spain is that for me. I would like to remind you all that colonialism is alive, and Spain has a responsibility and a colonial debt to Black and Indigenous peoples. And all of these control mechanisms over our bodies are still pretty much alive. And they just renew itself, you know, depending on the context, and especially on this current where left-wing contexts, well-lived governments flirt with, you know, oppressive politics, and specifically oppressive policies upon Black and Indigenous bodies. Specifically here in Spain, in the south border, throughout this year, 800 people have died. People who are coming from the African continent trying to cross the borders, and the border is militarized. And whoever is trying to survive, whoever makes it through the border, they encounter very hard politics for the foreign foreigners law. And this law basically prevents that you can leave. It says for at least 2 years you cannot access proper jobs, formal jobs, and this operates in most of the bodies that come through the Mediterranean. And that basically makes find face to face with these foreigners low, and exclusively as well when we're talking about migrant jails. There are jails that are specifically built for migrants, and it's very, because there is a big silence from the government when it comes to talk about these type of policies, you know, that are really affecting mostly Black communities, people who are coming from the global South. And I think this is an alarm, for us, because our main government is on a third, say, place in power, general power. And I'm currently based in Barcelona, but I also lived in Madrid. And right now, their mayor is a right-wing politician who is making laws against the LGBTQI plus community. And it affects me as a gender non-conforming person myself. And it excluding trans people, there is a big pathologization upon trans bodies. And this law specifically is talking about Black and migrant and sexual workers will not be able to access formal jobs, proper jobs. And this is directly related to this foreigners law. And this law prohibits the prohibits sharing sexual propaganda or erotic propaganda. And this is very important for me to name and share with you all, because this is specifically made for Black women, Black trans women, and the LGBTQI community who are sex workers, sexual workers in any way. And so this is also affecting organizations that are working on these topics. We're trying to change the status of this foreigners law and trying to also help over 500 people who are living without uh, proper papers
Unfortunately, this is the black backlash that is becoming dramatic. Before giving the floor to Happy, I, I just want to remind everyone that you could use the Q&A session or the chat box to interact, to ask whatever question you may have. You may have for the panelists. I know it's not an easy exercise, but they will try as much as possible to answer to your questions. And of course, at the end of the conversation, we will set some time to respond to the questions. I will now give the floor to Happy to ask you, say something at the rise of European politicians who are racist and anti-gender. Also, to say something about the impacts on feminism, Black feminism.
Hi, everyone. First, much gratitude to BFF for the invitation and to 210 folk who are here. So thank you all so much for showing up and joining us in this conversation. It is, having listened to Anik, Edem, and Iki, it feels hard. I know about you also. I'm sending mad love to Black family everywhere. It's a difficult moment to be Black right now. I'm going to be speaking, the question maybe got lost in translation, but the question I'm speaking specifically about is about the impact of the atrocities we're seeing in Europe, particularly on funding and funding globally. And the reason I'm going to be very specific about funding is I work at Mama Cash. Mama Cash is the oldest international women's fund, founded around a kitchen table. So there's moments I'm like, oh, there's a genesis of BFF and Mama Cash. We have that in common, kitchen tables. So Mama Cash was founded in 1983 by 5 radical lesbian feminists seated around a kitchen table in Amsterdam. And they had this idea to move funding globally right from the beginning. They always wanted to fund globally because they held internationalist politics, recognizing it's not, if the Netherlands is free in this idea that currently is quite real in Dutch politics, that if everybody in the Netherlands is free, it actually means most likely everybody around the world is suffering because of that freedom. So they wanted to upend that idea by moving capital that had come from the enslavement and the colonization that the Dutch colonies had been doing in that moment and move that money back. And that idea about, as we said, Mama Cash trying to figure out how do we move money from where capitalism says it should be to where capitalism says it shouldn't be. So I name myself as a professional money launderer because that's what we're in this for. And that's what Mama Cash has been doing over the last 40 years, over 40 years, and has moved over 140 million euro to over 160 countries around the world. So I'm mad proud about being part of Mama Cash whenever I name those statistics. And that's the place I'll be speaking from. So the impact of this moment right now is, I'm going to speak specifically of three of the biggest European funders in terms of overseas development assistance, so donor funding that moves to feminist and women's rights movements. I'm speaking about Sweden, the Netherlands, and Germany. I'll start with the Netherlands because that's the context which I know most deeply about because that's where Mama Cash is based. So Dutch funding, as far as we can tell, is funding that the Dutch funding is the Netherlands is the largest donor of money that moves directly into the hands of what we name as frontline feminist activists around the world, because of how, after many years of working with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, how they've shifted how they move money. And this year, around March this year, when after the election results and all the different negotiations that happened, what happened was the Dutch government put in place a minister of foreign trade and development assistance who says that they want to dismantle civil society and they want to stop funding. They want to stop the Dutch engaging in development aid. In our mild estimations, that means over the next 5 years, starting from 2026, over 600 million euro is leaving the feminist movements as we know it. That's a big deal because, as I said, the Dutch funding is the largest funding from development, ODA, that we know of that moves directly into the hands of frontline feminist actors. So this money has made a difference. And this is what the Minister of Foreign Trade and Development has stated. She has made racist statements publicly about asylum seekers before she became minister, so it was not a surprise. So the Dutch government has said that they will not renew, as far as we can tell, up until now, the funding that is going to civil society. And so we're all kind of sitting wondering what to do. There's a lot of action and organizing that is happening to try and make sure that does not happen, from folks running campaigns within the Netherlands to try and change the position of the government, to other folks who are doing campaigns to try and mobilize the 600 million, because it will mean there's a lot of feminist organizing around the world that will shut down. A lot of Black feminist organizing will shut down because they are funded by this funding. So it matters. And there's a lot of activity trying to happen. And also trying to figure out what do we need to do in the Dutch context in the next time before elections happen so that this government is not elected again. So that's another axis of work that's happening. But they're saying that that's one of the things that's happening. The other context I'll talk briefly about is about Sweden, and talk about them in the context of two governments, so Sweden and Germany, that had adopted feminist foreign policies. So I think most of us accept that feminist foreign policies are not the panacea. If anything, they're a contradiction in so many ways. Feminist foreign policy, what the hell? Don't think I'm allowed to curse, so I'll try not to. So they're contradictions. We recognize that. At the same time, at least for us as Mama Cash, the framework of a feminist foreign policy has allowed us to push states around their commitments on funding that is moving to civil society. And that has been an entry point for a lot of conversations with different governments that have adopted what they're calling their feminist foreign policies. At the same time, so that was, for example, quite a significant actor in the Swedish context to try and get the Swedish government, not trying to, but also managed to get the Swedish government to increase its funding, because they had I can't remember the exact name, but a frame of the feminist foreign policy. They have a new right-wing government, and one of the first things this government did was to retract that feminist foreign policy. And as part of that is we have seen backtracking of funding that is going towards gender equality, feminist movements from the Swedish context. It's reducing. And there's not as many mechanisms now to hold the Swedish government to account, because they don't have any commitments other than what they've committed to a percentage of their ODA. But even that, the counting of that gets very complicated, because they've figured out how to meet their commitments and at the same time reduce their budget. And the last government that I'll talk about is Germany. So more recently, elections happened in the east of Germany, and there was the establishment of there was an increase in terms of the governments that came in. So it was a center-left government that came in, but this center-left governing coalition has planned 1 billion in cuts to their National Development Agency for 2025, and even more extreme cuts to humanitarian aid in 2024. The German government has also not upheld its promises to meet the target that has been set on ODA or to match defense spending. And this is coming from what is being called a center-left governing coalition. So in all, these are three governments that have contributed a lot towards ODA, and all signs are pointing to this funding is reducing. It's reducing quickly, it's reducing drastically. We're talking about millions and billions of euro that is leaving civil society writ large. And we know of those big numbers, very small portions of that actually get to the communities that we're interested in, Black feminist communities. And so the possibilities of that funding getting to them is even shrinking more greatly. That's the context with regards to government funding. We know with philanthropy also in Europe, which is also happening, a lot of foundations in Europe are getting in place boards and trustees that are pulling funding away from civil society more generally, and particularly away from gender equality, feminist movements, gender justice kind of work. There's quite a few different foundations in Europe that have declared this very recently, either explicitly or implicitly in their decision making, and that is also more funding that is leaving the feminist movements as we know. So all in all, yeah, things are tough. Things are tough.
Let's take a deep breath. Thank you very much, Ati. This context and all the informations are quite saddening. And we're talking about millions and billions of reduction. And all these are happening now. So we need to talk about how we can organize and keep existing, and what do we put in place to kind of confront this situation that is going to make everything hard. And in this context, I would like to ask to the panelists to know whether there is a set program for Black feminists. Is there any left sides or coalitions to which maybe we could resort to, or in the spaces you collaborate with? Is there any hope from those sides? Starting with Eki.
Yes, so yes, I think on a community level, there are lots of coalitions, there's lots of working together, particularly for us, a reproductive justice initiative. We are a very firm believer in collective action, working with other communities, even community events that we do. I'm always like, okay, who can we partner with? Even if, you know, anything, just have another organization, and then they bring a whole group of people to our events, and then we get to connect, and then we build on those partnerships. So I think there are definitely, on a community level, lots of that is happening. On a national party political level, the short answer is no. And that's because their agenda doesn't align with our agenda. A lot of the, you know, for example, if I say big gender-based violence organizations, you know, including some who have very radical roots, who we were born out of like the 80s, 90s, very radical roots, have sadly become part of the establishment. You know, they very much want to work with the government. It's very much about staying in line. And that's because especially in the UK now, the only way to get money to do a lot of these things is government funding. So a lot of organizations feel like they have to toe their line. They can't say this, they can't be to that. And so, you know, we don't feel like that because we're very, you know, lucky and grateful. We get funded by the Black Feminist Fund, so we can say the things that other people can't say. So on a community level, there's a lot of that happening. I think even right now, it's very frustrating because there's a lot of talk about people being like released from prisons, and immediately there was a panic from, you know, the mainstream, you know, women's move, you know, organizations be like, oh no, these people are gonna come back and harm women, etc., which is true. However, the next step is not, well, okay, if we've locked people up for this long, for harming women to begin with, and they're going to leave the place that we've locked them up to just come back and harm women, maybe we should have a conversation about why we're locking them up and what's happening when we lock them up. Nobody wants to talk about that because, you know, they don't. Everybody wants to toe the line. Everybody wants to be on the government's good side. Even now, it's incredibly frustrating, especially in the sexual and reproductive sector, because everyone is acting like it's an amazing thing now that we have this new party in government. But it's really, you know, if you peel the mask, it's pretty much like the same one. Like, it's just, you know, dressed a little bit different. It's basically me. Like when I put on a wig, sometimes people are like, oh, is that you? I'm like, it is me. I just have a wig on. That's really what's happening here in the political establishment. So the current Labour government is, you know, anti-immigration. You know, like I said earlier, they're talking about, you know, the finances are bad and, you know, working people need to be squeezed harder, you know, etc. All of these things, we can fund this, we can fund that, and very much into, you know, continuing to whip up racism, continuing to participate in, you know, transphobia. Like I mentioned earlier, it's what they're calling culture wars at the moment in the UK. They're very much willing to participate in all of those things. And so it's very frustrating. You know, during the elections, lots of people say, no, we're going to vote for this, no. And, you know, it exposes this idea that voting or elections are the be all and end all. Yes, they're incredibly important. They're the be all and end all for the parties involved because this is how they continue to exist. But a lot of us, that's not where the struggle happens. The struggle happens before, the struggle happens during, the struggle happens after, right? And it's a shame that we've had a right-wing Tory conservative government for almost 15 years to have a Labour Party that's supposedly left-wing, I would say more centre, just capitulate. And we see it across Europe, right? We see centre, you know, Happy was talking earlier about the center left. And I was thinking to myself, wow, left is doing a heavy lifting here. It sounded like a lot of center to me, which, you know, is what's happening. It's like when fascism rears its head, when economic crises are down, when all of these things happen, you know, unfortunately, if people aren't strong and principled, if people don't have roots in communities and coalitions all across, you know, whatever geographical area they are, it is very, very easy. And we see it now in the UK with the Labour Party to just capitulate to the centre and the right, because the media is very powerful, right? They whip up all this racism and these parties feel like, well, we have to go along. What is there in saying? There's no evidence to back up a lot of the things that they're doing and saying, but everybody just goes along with it because it's much easier for them to do that than to actually stand up for the things that matter. And so there is no, the short answer is no. On a national level, there really isn't, but on a community level, there is a lot of that. Like I said, we at Reproductive Justice, we're a firm believer in that. We're working with BLM UK, for example, as an organization we've been working closely with, working with organizations like Level Up, who've been doing a lot of work in terms of getting pregnant women out of prisons. For example, they've even worked with lawyers to have case law, which means in the future, we're gonna see less and hopefully zero pregnant women being sent to prisons. That's a big win. That's incredible. We're seeing organizations like AS for Activism who do like reading clubs around theory. And, you know, we have conversations about, okay, well, what does this mean today? How does this apply today? And we have, you know, Muslim RJ organizations like Adia Collective, for example, who do a lot of work in the Muslim community around reproductive justice. So on a community level, absolutely yes. And if anything's going to happen, that's really where it's going to happen to change things overall. I don't have a lot of faith in government. I don't have a lot of faith in the political parties or the establishment, sadly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Overall, I can perceive this feeling of uh, making people vote for the powers establishments, but finally, we and this feeling is shared by many of us. Let me come back to Iki for their reflection.
Thank you all. It's actually very hard to be synced with the local access to funding. Sometimes there is this very simple speech around diversity and democracy, and the structure, the social structure in the Spanish state really implies very unequal levels of existence, because when you're talking about people who are with the non-legal, non-regular status, and we cannot make it through the citizen standards, citizenship standards, it's like we need to coexist within a network of alliances that lie beneath um institutionalism, so fortunately there are some parallel levels, some ways of existing at the side of it. A lot of Black organizations have been able to organize to exist in an underclass type of living. We've been working with refugees and people who have the citizen status, so that we can access to very limited resources, very limited funding, who are working with organizations, anti-racist organizations, who really have a focus on us specifically. But sometimes these organizations will, sometimes they will just distort or just twist our narratives, distort what we're saying to accommodate it into what they need or what they want to hear. But if we really use the name, the real name that this situation has, which is colonialism, racism, then, I mean, if we use this type of language, we will not access funding. So we need to use this type of polite or very light language so that we can access to funding. Sometimes when there is a link among Black organizations and Black communities, sometimes we need to, yeah, we need to strengthen our struggle by coming up together. I will use this term, which is cimarronear the state. What I mean by this is to put some tricks into the state, play their game, but also kind of like trick them into um, listening or connecting with our narrative without pretending to change what we really want to do or what we really want to say. There is this word, this organization that is working with intersectionality, but they only have it in their name. There is another white collectiveness that are working for climate change, but without taking into account the deep uh, climate problems that they're having within the African continent and Black communities around the world. So this is a very hard struggle we're working on, but we're getting the job done. So thank you.
Over to Anik. Thank you. I have a lot of common points with Adam on these matters. Actually, like Adam said, our short answer will be a long one, actually, because the issue has to do with the historical uncomfort with the French government, which has always invisibilized the fight for racial justice and requested colored people to align their fights to what they want. Like, for instance, the left-wing parties in their fights, for instance, so the fight as labor, for instance, but not like as a Black women or other things. So they want us to be parts of the labor fights, actually. And the issues on race in the France context actually put everyone, including the left, in a uncomfortable situation. And the coalition of left parties following the elections that happened in June, you have the normal sections on the programs for housing, education, etc. And when it came to anything with racism, there was no concrete thing apart from the discourse in the laws. So for us, we have reached a situation of critical tension between the reformism of left side parties and our realities, because and also in other radical parties of groups of colored people in France, our communication with the left parties has become difficult, because during the legislative elections that happened in June and early July were marked by the threats of the extreme, the far west, the far right parties. And we were receiving a lot of pressure to mobilize votes from colored people in France, including the majority of Black people and Arabs. And the communications were around voting to block the far right party. And we were in this discourse where they were coming to look for our votes just to block the far west. And we don't have the words in French to say it, but I would say it's we were just doing tokenism, because they were just coming to us just to block the far west, the threats of the far west. And after that, they wouldn't actually keep any of the promises they made to us, or take care of any of the concerns of colored people. They are not radical on imperialism. They are not radical on the liberation of New Caledonia, on the liberation of the other territories of France. So be it on climate justice on these territories in Guadeloupe or Martinique, all these things are not taken care of. So like Eden was explaining, there are groups here at the community levels trying to raise their voice and try to pressure on the left parties. But at the same time, we have by saying to them, if you want us to vote for you this time, you have to keep your promises. We don't want you to just forget about us once you've been elected. And there are a lot of coalitions of community groups, radical community groups who have been created, like Front Anti-Racist, Front Anti-FN, and organizations that were already existing, like Front de Mer, which is an organization that was existing somewhere. Front de Mer is like a mother front. And these are organizations that were organized in neighborhoods, and they included young people, women to resist to police violence, violence in education, and for against colored people in France. We also had a type of recommendation we made to them to let them know that if we vote for you, we want these recommendations on Palestine and other issues to be taken care of. Unfortunately, this power dynamic was not balanced enough. It's so we include a lot of people living in the streets, and we are also in a situation in France where the president actually takes all the powers, and they are getting closer to the indicators of actually the election parties
We should
who
have
will end up having
a
the
a
prime
representative
minister.
from the left, and the president has completely refused, and he appointed prime minister from the right party from the 80s, a very conservative. So that's the situation. That's what I can say. Whereas the leftist parties had managed to bring to get a majority of voices, but we find ourselves with the national parliament that is very divided. What we fear is that the interests, the rights of women, of Black women, immigrants, and queer Black women will be the first to be impacted. And also, and I'm just concluding now, that everything that I have just said is really look at the relationship that France and the French government has with our organization, Moisi, because with Moisi, we have often been targeted by the government, a lot of criticism. There have even been laws because since 1999, it is forbidden in France to organize situations that talk about equity. There are certain people, if you want to have a group only for women, it is illegal. You can be attacked in court for discrimination against men. If you want to talk about Black women, it's illegal. You want to talk about discrimination, you're going to be attacking white people. So that really gets in the way of our activities, but it is a way for the government to put pressure on us and to try and keep us from doing the work that we do. But the problem is that the leftist parties are not supporting us when those kinds of things happen. We have not had the support of the leftist parties when we've come against defamation campaigns, when we have had articles even in the New York Times to try and help us to organize our festival. We were accused of racism because we are organizing spaces only for women or queer persons. We have this very complicated relationship with the leftist parties. So what we need to do is to continue to put pressure on them. We know that it is better to have a leftist government, generally speaking, than these extreme right parties that were created by former Nazists and which have a very strong links with the colonial past, the colonial history. But the relationship with the leftist parties is also very, very difficult because they are very Republican and they're actually very reformist, but the agenda is they don't really address what is really vital for Black people. And that is really not part of their priorities. It's not part of what they understand when they talk about racism. They do not have a way of understanding structural racism in the society. Thank you very much. Nick, I saw Adam rolling her eyes as we shared. So we're talking about what is happening in Europe, and just to support what you have just said. But oftentimes we have strategies of looking for Black faces. We're looking for people who we're saying that all of these things are very important, but there are a lot of different groups of people. Now, just to remind all of us that we do have the question and answer function. We're going to do the best that we can to answer as many questions as we can. Any questions that will have been addressed to the panelists, and we shall look at a number of questions when we get to the question and answer section. But before that, I see that Happy's baby is part of the meeting. We'd like to welcome them on board. Thank you very much, Happy. The last question that you had raised, Happy, you're asking a question that is very important. You're asking a question that is important. What is the importance of financing unique Black projects and the anti-democratic movement in Europe? So we've got a little bit beyond the time, but I'm going to ask you to try and answer that question. What is the importance of financing feminist activities?
Yeah, thanks. The next generation is here and they have their take on everything. So thank you. I think that's a very quick question to your, there's a very quick answer to your question, Sarah. Critical. That's it. Like the liberation you're pushing for is not possible without Black feminists leading it. And from my view, I think they need all the resources they can get to lead this from whatever section. So all funders should just be pouring money into Black feminist organizing, because that's where the liberation is happening, people. But as we know, funders want numbers, figures, story, more data than just us telling them fund them. And so one thing that Mama Cash did in 2021 was we did a mapping to get a bit of an understanding of what does Black and Muslim feminist organizing in Europe look like, and what kind of change is being led by Black and Muslim feminist organizing in Europe. And I'll share some of the things that we found out. So one, I'll first talk about what was the state of funding to these movements. One thing was many of the folks that we spoke with made clear to us that they don't necessarily use the feminist label, as they feel that mainstream feminist movement is white dominated and issues that affect Black and Muslim feminists are not represented. So they prefer to say Afro-feminist, Black feminist, Afro-European, use that language. What happens there often is that leads to criminalizing, like Anik was talking about. Walking around naming yourself as a Black feminist organization in some sections of Europe means you will not get funded. And that's real, that's live, and that has an impact on how our movements are able, or therefore not able, to access funding when they're holding both their politics and their reality side to side. Sorry. Needs to. So that was one of the things that came through very clearly in the work that we did. Another thing is many of the groups that we talked to who are active in Europe are not registered. And again, that impacts their ability, or therefore their inability, to get funding. And they're not registered because they're criminalized, because they're migrant folks, or they don't have access to papers, so they can't register. They don't want to register because the regime is fascist and they don't want to be associated with the regime. Like, there's a myriad of reasons, but that translated to a lot of groups aren't able to access funding. And the last thing, the one finding we found was majority of the groups that we spoke to are actually self-financed. That is about 76% of the groups that we spoke with. 35% of them are receiving some degree of private funding, and only 17% of them are receiving government funding. So what that data showed was clearly Black and Muslim feminists in Europe are not accessing resources from mainstream sources, and that does translate to the size of their budgets, the size of the organizational budgets, and what the scale of work that they're able to do. Then to the question about why is it important to fund Black and Muslim feminist organizing based on this, was it's so clear. It's one of those, but of course, findings that you do the research to almost, I don't think researchers would agree with this, but it's just proving what we know instinctively, and we know based on what we see around. But they're creating change. These Black movements are creating change in European context. they use intersectional frameworks, and that means that intersecting issues are being addressed. So by funding Black trans sex workers in Europe, you're supporting Black movements, trans movements, and sex worker movements, and supporting the liberation of Black movements, trans movements, and sex worker movements. And most, if not all, of the groups that we spoke to are using intersectional frames in their organizing. And that does mean that the liberation of so many more people is made possible day by day. Another thing is a lot of the groups that we spoke to are self-led, and they are not uniquely, and they do not only uniquely understand the issues they're experiencing, what they need. Sorry, let me say that again. So the groups are self-led, and these movements do not only uniquely understand the issues their communities are experiencing and addressing, but they are doing this and shining the light on addressing links between racialized and gender-based violence, housing and immigration policy. They're leading organizing, campaigning, lobbying, advocating across the spread of issues. And that's why it's so important to fund these movements, because of the diversity of tactics and the way that they're understanding issues that affect them and the communities around them. Another way that they're creating change is they are building collective power and claiming justice in their different parts of Europe. They're collectively mobilizing thousands to participate in protests and online dialogues. We've been told about that, we've seen that. And they every day understand that no representation means no change, so they're bringing their voices to bring change into the context. So our mapping was like unequivocally clear that Black feminist organizing in Europe is creating change. And if we want the liberation of all people, we must be pouring money into Black feminist movements. And the resourcing that is currently going into those movements is minuscule. It is absolutely minuscule. And the change that is possible, even with that minuscule funding, is liberatory. Can we imagine how much more liberation is possible if more resources was directed to these communities?
Very much happy. There are a lot of things that we need to understand. Unfortunately, we are coming towards the end of our webinar. Now, Edem, I know had given you the floor, but we really have to move to the question and answer session. And perhaps in the course of that session, you might be able to say a word or two. So what I'm going to do then is the three questions. There are the three questions that have been raised in the question and answer. I'm going to ask you to give very concise answers. Really, we have only a few minutes left. Let's begin with the first question from the public. So it's something that Idem said, and we see that the movement is becoming. I'm trying to look at the question in the question and answer. So in my view, we're saying that the rest of dominant caste supremacy culture paraded through people of African descent in the US involved politics for survival. I'm assuming many Black people are radically unapologetic about being seemingly okay with atrocities being played as we near. Can you share realistic steps where populations can make prior to presidential and meaningful elections? So we can take a note very quickly. See, the second question, which I think is in the group, is the issue of solidarity. Do you think that there are enough partnerships among the Black feminists who are in the South and those who are in the North and who have a shared agenda? Has anything changed? That was the third question, and then the third one that I'm going to translate. This is the efforts of decolonization that are currently being that are happening in Europe. This is a group that is based in Amsterdam, and decolonization is not very popular in Amsterdam. So at the same time, the colonial projects. There's a lot of the diversity. There's a lot of vocabulary that we use about decolonization and so on and so forth. So these are the three questions that I'd like to ask you to answer. Do answer them as quickly as you can, and we're going to close thereafter.
Got it. Thank you so much. So yes, I think that there are so many other ways people can get involved. So when I was saying earlier about people organizing and doing things in their community, I think is a big part of it. You know, a lot of things when we're talking about change, a complete, you know, social, a change of the society direction, etc., it very rarely, and it usually doesn't happen from the top down. And I think nothing was so clear. You know, things happen and you learn from them. I was quite, you know, I was in the labor movement, big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, was very much part of the campaign when he took power. But I think what I learned from that period of time is you can have all the politics, that's great. But if you don't have the community, if you don't have the grassroots, if you don't understand the state and everything, the media, everything is going to come at you with everything they have because you are literally a threat to their existence. That is how your project will fail. So in order for us to shift the political climate, it's going to have to start from, I know people throw the word around a lot, the grassroots, but it's going to have to start from communities. Like whatever community you have, whatever that looks like, whether it's your town, whether it's your city, whether it's your group of friends, wherever that might look, in community comes in various forms, even whether it's where you work, right? Like unionizing, right? Being a trade union member, being part of a union, that's a form of like collective action and coming together, understanding. So I think that's incredibly important. The next question was about the decolonizing movement. You know, I'm just very skeptical because I think that people like to appear, and I think Anik was alluding to this earlier, people like to appear to be down with it, right? Decolonial, yes, you know, I'm up with it. But people have to ask themselves, are they really willing to do the work and give up the things that allows decolonization to happen? That's the question that we need to ask. And so it's going to be painful. We have to drag people kicking and screaming. This is what I wanted to say earlier to Anik. The left, you know, the white left, whatever you want to call them, we have to drag them kicking and screaming. Like they've got no choice. They have to. Because Fanon said, capitalism, racism, one is cause, the other is effect. Right? And so you have to understand this thing that you think is just about you that you're fighting for actually is connected to other people. And so it's an incumbent for you to listen. I always operate off the basis that I have something to, you know, to learn from other people. And also we learn from our mistakes, incredibly important. I'm going to stop there because of time so that others can come in maybe if there's time again. I hope I wasn't too fast. I probably was. I'm so sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Edem. On a à peu près 4 minutes à partager en 3 personnes, donc je vous laisse faire les calculs. Et je laisse Iki suivre. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you all for all of this that you have shared here today. This question related to colonization, I think it's a very like in fashion speech, you know, in Europe. And I think it's important for me to understand that our connection with our ancestrality is already a practice of anti-colonization that is already involving many people from many gender. It's an anti-colonialist practice and is already fighting against the binaries idea of gender. I think that our day-to-day exercise, the struggle we do with our organizations, even if we're not using the word anti-colonialism words, you know, in our names, everything we do in our day-to-day is already that. And it's like we do not need an agenda of anti-colonialist activities because everything we do is per se against the colonial practices. And what we do is look into, is towards just breaking, the systems, the colonialist practices that are being held in our territories and our lands. So it's what we do.
MySIF is part of several international networks where we try to learn from each other, and like colonialism, capitalism, and racism is just like a weapon. We are either at the beginning or at the end of the weapon, but we are all in the same spectrum, but we are just holding a certain position on the weapon. So be it a Senegalese feminist or Black feminists in France, we know we are all on the same spectrum, but we are just holding different positions, and we are having different manifestations. So we are doing our Black feminism in a Pan-African perspective. It's difficult with the visa issues, the justice of those systems, and the easiness for Black people to move around the world as they want. It's often difficult to understand each other, but it's a beautiful and necessary work. And on decolonization, I do agree with Jackie, because to me, when we look at the speech on Palestine, and we can understand that there is a deep misunderstanding of decolonization, because what is happening there is colonization, and it's colonization integrating violence. And when we look at the speeches, those people talking about decolonizing things throughout the year, we can see that they don't feel at ease at all with the true image of colonization that is happening in Palestine. And I can't wait to see the true decolonization, like what is currently happening in Africa on their mines, gold mines, diamond mines. True things are happening regarding land property. All these things are what I would call true decolonization. Thank you very much, Annex. A very nice ending words, and a lot of gratitude to all of you. And this brings us to the close of this webinar. I want to thank my colleague, Maria Clara, and I would like to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And actually, you are making my moderator work very complicated given the quality of your interventions. We could have taken 3 hours to actually do this webinar. Thank you all for your contributions.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Brazil. I'm very happy, very glad, proud, because making this event come true demands a true dedication of the whole team of the Black Feminist Fund. Has been focused on making this event come true. And so I would firstly like to thank everyone in our team that throughout the whole webinar was here in the backstage supporting Sarah, who was beautifully guiding this conversation. So I would like to start by thanking everyone who made this event possible from before the event as well as the event itself, and also what's going to happen after. I'm Maria Clara Araújo. I am the coordinator of partnerships with movements of the Black Feminist Fund. I recognize myself as an Afro-Brazilian travesti. I'm from Recife in Pernambuco, but I am based in São Paulo. And the series of Black Feminist Politics is part of our following plan plan that has been thought and executed to highlight the policies, the practice of, and the actions of our partner movements. And this is the very first session, the very first webinar session we had that composed our Black Feminist series. I would like to thank all of the interpreters who helped us to materialize once again our commitment with linguistic justice. So I will namely thank everyone: Pascaline, Wanjico, Alexandra, Thais, Simone, Alicia, Sarah, and Rem. Thank you. Thank you very much. There is obviously a commitment within our end to be able to build this dialogue, this transnational dialogue among Black feminist movements from all over the world. And this type of action is also a response to what we were talking about today, the movements that are anti-Black population, anti-LGBTQI plus people. They are connected. They are transnational movements that are happening in a connected way, and they are sharing grammars and mobilizing strategies. And it also puts us a challenge as a Black feminist movement and as movements from different places, so that we are also connected and in dialogue, as we say in Brazil, working connected, working in networks. So I will connect it to a question from Valdecir, who is a historical Black feminist, and she puts precisely that how we have testimonies of how our problems are connected, and also what are the impacts of these, the growth of fascism in the lives of Black population. The conversation we had today is not based on an abstract plan. The growth, the rise of fascism has tangible actions in the lives of the Black populations. And so events such as this one, just like other opportunities that we're building of interchange, of exchanging, are extremely necessary in a time like this. I think this is the core. As Iki put, as Anik put, as Happy put it, fascism and racism and colonialism is not new, but there are certain singularities of the time we are now that we need to recognize and we need to address. And this is why this panel was happening. The Black feminist movements are not unilateral, and they don't act on one theme only, as philanthropy makes it seem sometimes. The panel today made it very clear that we are discussing and acting about migration, fighting against police violence, trying to strengthen the debate on sexual and reproductive rights. And so if maybe intersectionality might have gotten lost in translation, or might have gotten lost in performative speeches, these Black feminist movements are materializing what it's like to work from this crossroads perspectives, to be affected by multiple oppressions, but also to be able to extract from these crossroads a power that is not only political, but also epistemological, but overall ethical. I think we have a beautiful ethical project from our Black feminist movements, and that also needs to be made visible. I would also like to highlight something that is an issue that speaks to all of us. We are still mobilizing language and grammar of citizenship and democracy. And to keep up what we've been seeing all over the world makes us wonder if all of the things we've seen, if all of these movements are not necessarily part of democracy itself. And so maybe we may need to rethink the grammar itself that we use, in which project we are trying to intensify. So there might be a speculative exercise that the Black movements are faced with. What other projects and political, that are both political and ethical, are being thought of from our projects that can be spread from our everyday practices on our grassroots territories? I don't think I can sum up everything that was said by the people who participated in our webinar as panelists. I would personally like to ask Iki, Anik, Happy, Adam, Sarah, who shined throughout this event. Thank you for accepting our invitation and to represent the organization that you're part of, Reproductive Justice Initiative. And Moasi are our partners from the Sustainability Fund, and Iki, who is representing the Solidarity Fund. And this is the way that the Black Feminist Fund makes a Black feminist work, establishing these transnational bridges, building these solidarity networks that are so necessary at this time. And then to end with a few messages, our next session of the Black Feminist Politics Series is probably going to happen around November. The next theme we're going to discuss that I think is actually absolutely connected to what we talked about today is about Black feminist movements in crisis, thinking about whether or not these crises are new in our experiences or if they're actually part of projects, long-term projects that continue to reverberate in our lives. And so I would like to invite all of you, all of the people who are part of our webinar today, to please apply as soon as we start sharing information about the next webinar. We are going to send a survey to all of you, to everyone who applied for this webinar in a few days, within a week, so that we can understand how all of this event reverberated for all of you. And that's it. Thank you very much. And as we say in Brazil, axé.